At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI garbage. And what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Daniel Pierce, and I'm going to be your narrator. Now, let's get into today's story. Sometimes the worst wars begin for the stupidest reasons, and when it came to stupid reasons, none was worse than the one that sparked the war between the Kror and the Vasog. It began when a health issue in the Kror ambassador's tail caused his scent-marking gland to splash liquid pheromone into the face of the Vasog great leader. Among the Kror, this would have marked something as property, but to the Vasog, it should have meant nothing but a little incident, except that he took it as a grave insult and declared war on the entire species over it. Now, the Deathworld Council was about to activate its ultimate problem-solving method during a crisis. The human they kept on standby, just in case. President Fopix's translucent skin rippled with waves of distress as he hurried through the corridors of the council headquarters. His flesh hung in deep folds that cascaded down his neck and arms, giving him the appearance of melted wax that had cooled in mid-drip. The texture was peculiar even among his people. The ticks, layers upon layers of semi-transparent dermis that other sapient considered rather strange. And today, there was nothing subtle about his appearance. The tiny purple veins that networked through his facial features throbbed visibly with each rapid heartbeat, threatening to burst through the delicate membrane that was his skin. He was old, and the weight of his 3 centuries pressed down on him with every step. But he didn't care about dignity right now. He cared about preventing a catastrophe. The Vasog invasion forces had already made planetfall on Zentar. Preliminary reports suggested thousands dead in the initial bombardment. Thousands more would follow in the coming hours if the Council didn't act. And all because of a biological accident, a malfunctioning gland. The absurdity of it made Fopix's stomach sacks churn with acidic frustration. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with a maintenance drone, which skittered away with an indignant chirp. Fopix didn't slow down. His destination was 2 levels below the main council chambers, in a section of the building that didn't appear on any public maps. The secure entrance looked like any other service panel, a smooth rectangle of dark alloy set into the wall. But when Fopix pressed his primary hand against it, the surface rippled and a gentle light scanned across his palm, reading the unique pattern of his dermal folds. A moment later, the panel slid aside. Beyond lay a small antechamber, sterile and definitely not well lit. The full immersion comm center was larger than he had remembered, though he had only been here twice before. It was enormous, far larger than any natural head should require. This was no ordinary communications device. This was a full immersion FTL quantum entangled neural interface, technology so advanced and so expensive that only 3 existed in the entire known galaxy. Below the helmet sat a contoured chair designed to accommodate a dozen different species body types. Fopix approached it slowly, his heart's hammering in an irregular rhythm. He'd never gotten used to this. The technology felt like witchcraft, like something that violated the natural order of reality. But it was the only way to communicate with someone across interstellar distances in real time. The only way to reach the human they called Mr. Scar. Fopix lowered himself into the chair, and the smart material immediately adjusted to his physiology, forming cushions where his body needed support and hardening where it needed structure. The helmet descended slowly until it filled his entire field of vision, and then it was upon him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the needles activated. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. It felt like falling and flying at the same time. Reality dissolved. The darkness of the helmet interior gave way to swirling colors that had no names, geometric patterns that hurt to perceive, and then dizziness hit hard. The FTL full immersion effect. He wanted to vomit, but he had no stomach here. He wanted to close his eyes, but they didn't exist. He was pure thought, pure awareness, hurtling through quantum space at speeds that would have torn his physical body into component atoms. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Reality reasserted itself, but it was a different reality now. Fopix felt solidity beneath him, a seat. He was in a ship, a small craft judging by the cramped interior. The cockpit was functional but sparse, apparently designed for everything except comfort. Displays covered every surface, showing readouts in a script that shifted and morphed as his translator implant struggled to keep up. Through the forward viewport, he could see the curve of a planet's atmosphere, painted in shades of orange and brown. And in the pilot's seat, not 5 feet away, sat the human, Mr. Scar. The nickname was appropriate. The right side of the human's face was a twisted landscape of scar tissue. A burn, Phopix had been told, from an incident in the human's military past. The damage ran from his temple to his jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent slight sneer. The eye on that side was cloudy, probably non-functional. The other side of his face was almost handsome, in the way humans measured such things. Strong jawline, sharp cheekbones, dark skin that contrasted with the pale scar tissue. But it was the human's hands that caught Phopix's attention now. They were moving across the controls, adjusting trajectory, compensating for atmospheric drag, making 1,000 microcorrections per second. Every display in the cockpit showed nominal readings, but the automated systems were dark. The human was flying manually, during a planetary entry, with all assistance turned off. It was insane. Even the most skilled pilots relied on computer assistance during the critical phases of atmospheric entry. The calculations required were supposedly beyond what any biological brain should be capable of processing in real time. The margin for error was measured in fractions of degrees and microseconds, and yet the human sat there, relaxed, his remaining good eye half-lidded, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Phopix opened his mouth to speak, but the human beat him to it. "Took you long enough." The human's voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. He didn't look away from the controls. "What happened, Phopix? You stopped for a nap on the way? I know you're old, but come on. Maybe it's time to delegate the commute to someone with working knees." Phopix felt a flash of indignation. He wanted to fire back, to make some crack about how the human wasn't exactly in his prime either. The gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the way his hands had started to develop the slight tremor of age. But there were more pressing matters to address, and trading barbs could wait. Instead, Phopix found himself staring at the planet below. It was growing larger by the second, details resolving from abstraction into reality. He could see continent shapes now, weather patterns, the glint of oceans. Something about the configuration nagged at his memory. "You have a mission," Phopix said, trying to inject some authority into his avatar's voice. "The Deathworld Council has voted. You need to go to planet Zinta, capital world of the Crawl people. The situation has deteriorated faster than we anticipated. The Visag have already..." He trailed off, his attention drawn to the horizon line visible through the viewport. As the ship rotated during its descent, he caught sight of a particular arrangement of landmasses, a distinctive pattern of islands in an equatorial ocean. His eyes widened. "Where are we?" he asked. The human laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "Where do you think we are, Phopix?" No, that's impossible. You're already on Zinta." "Give the man a prize." The human made a final adjustment to the control yoke, and the ship's descent smoothed out. "You know, for a council of supposedly intelligent beings, you people are remarkably predictable." "How?" Phopix's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "The council only finalized the vote 4 hours ago. We're half a galaxy away from Zinta. Even the fastest FDL drive, it'd take..." "Relax." The human's scarred mouth pulled into what might have been a smile. "You know what I do when I'm on standby. I monitor the underground and galactic network. News feeds, diplomatic channels, military communications, everything that doesn't get filtered through your official channels, and I pay attention to what you bureaucrats are arguing about in those endless council sessions." The human tapped a few commands into his console, fine-tuning their approach angle. "When I saw the first reports about the ambassador's little accident, I knew what was coming. Knew the Visag would overreact. Knew the council would dither for a few days while trying to find a diplomatic solution. Knew that eventually you'd come calling. So I packed my gear and headed here 3 days ago." "But the cost, the fuel alone is an unsanctioned FTL jump." "You're paying me to be on standby all the time," the human interrupted. Seems to me the best way to earn that paycheck is to guess where I might be summoned and get there before the council bureaucracy churns out a decision and you show up like a ghost to order me around. Besides, I was right, wasn't I? Phopix couldn't argue with that logic, even though it made his head hurt. He looked out the viewport again, really seeing it now. As the ship continued its rotation, the view shifted to show a sprawling city on the continent below. Towers of coral-like growth that the Kror had cultivated over millennia. Organic architecture that melded seamlessly with the natural landscape. Zentar's capital. He recognized it from the briefing materials. And somewhere down there, in a hastily established forward base, was the Vasog Great Leader, coordinating the invasion of an entire planet over a diplomatic insult. The humans' hands moved one final time across the controls, and the ship's descent became perfectly vertical. They dropped through a layer of clouds, and suddenly they were in the atmosphere proper, buffeted by the winds that would have torn a less skilled pilot off course. But the human compensated for each gust before it hit, reading the air currents like a language, dancing with the planet's weather patterns. The landing was textbook perfect, softer than most automated systems would have managed. The ship settled onto a flat expanse of reddish soil without a tremor. Through the viewport, Phopix could see they were in a clearing surrounded by the tall trees native to Zentar. The city was visible in the distance, perhaps 20 miles away, its organic buildings reaching toward the sky. The human was out of his seat before the engines had fully spun down. He moved fast, wasting neither time nor energy. Within seconds, he had crossed through a storage locker and was pulling out equipment. First came the armor, not the bulky, powered suits that most species favored, but something sleeker, flexible plates of advanced ceramic composite that would stop most projectile and energy weapons while still allowing full mobility. The human shrugged into it like it was a second skin, and Phopix noticed how the armor had been modified over years of use. Scratches repaired with filler, dents hammered out, custom attachments welded on for carrying extra gear. Then came the weapons. A sidearm holstered at the hip, some kind of chemically propelled projectile weapon that seemed absurdly primitive until you remembered that humans had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of throwing metal at high velocity. Knives strapped to various points on his body, positioned for easy access with either hand. A compact energy weapon of Vixian design maglocked to his chest plate. Explosives, small but devastatingly effective, clipped to his belt in neat rows. Phopix watched in fascination as the human transformed before his eyes. The casual pilot who traded jokes a moment ago was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. A predator preparing for the hunt. "What now?" Phopix asked, his avatar's voice sounding small in the suddenly tense atmosphere of the ship. The human paused in his preparations, one hand on a strap of his growing backpack. He looked at Phopix with his one good eye, and there was no humor in it now. "Which one do you want me to... The question lingered in the air. Phopix felt his consciousness, distant in a calm center half a galaxy away, recoil slightly from the casual way the human phrased it. But this was what they had hired him for. This was the council's decision, made in the chamber of marble and good intentions, where representatives debated and voted and pretended that their hands would stay clean. "The Vasog Great Leader," Phopix said, surprised at how steady his avatar's voice came out. "The council was unanimous. His forces are the ones invading this planet. Even if that were the case, the incident that sparked this war was clearly not the Kror's fault. An unfortunate health issue, nothing more. The Vasog leader's response has been entirely disproportionate, and diplomatic channels have been exhausted." He realized he was justifying the decision, trying to convince himself as much as the human, but the human just shrugged. "Seems fair to me." Just like that. No moral deliberation, no hand-wringing, no debate about the ethics of assassination versus conventional warfare. The human had heard the target designation and accepted it as fact. He went back to his preparations, adding more items to his pack, what looked like medical supplies, ration bars, some kind of technical equipment that Phopix didn't recognize. Phopix's mind raced ahead, trying to imagine how the human would approach this task. The Vasog Great Leader would be in the heart of his forward base, surrounded by thousands of soldiers, protected by the best security that military technology could provide. The base itself would be shielded, its perimeter patrolled, its airspace locked down. Getting close enough for any conventional assassination method would be impossible. Even with the human's legendary skills, surely he couldn't just... The hatch opened. Phopix blinked. The human had finished his preparations in what felt like seconds. The backpack was secured, the weapons checked, the armor sealed, and now the human was stepping out into Zintar's orange-tinted sunlight, moving quickly towards some destination he had apparently already selected. For a moment, Phopix's avatar remained frozen in its seat. He knew intellectually that his presence here was ephemeral, just a projection of consciousness tethered to the implant in the human's skull. If he stayed behind, the system would automatically relocate his avatar to maintain connection. But the sensation of being left behind was disconcerting nonetheless. He rushed to follow, his avatar's legs pumping as he descended the ship's ramp. The ground beneath his feet felt solid despite being mere simulation. The air smelled faintly of something floral, Zintar's unique atmospheric composition triggering sensory data transmitted through the quantum link. "You look tired," the human called back over his shoulder. He was already 10 paces ahead, following some path that only he could see through the alien forest. "That's impressive for an avatar. Didn't know that was possible." "I am tired," Phopix admitted, his avatar's breath coming in gasps that mirrored his real body's exhaustion half a galaxy away. "This war, this senselessness of it all, the thousands already dead, the thousands more who will die. It's draining me, both physically and mentally. The council chambers have become a pressure cooker of stress, and I've been at the center of it all." The human stopped abruptly, his head tilted, one hand raised in a gesture for silence. Phopix froze, suddenly aware of how much noise his avatar had been making. But the human wasn't listening to him. He was staring at the horizon, where Phopix could now see a column of smoke rising into the orange sky. "Interesting," the human muttered to himself. Before Phopix could ask what was interesting, the human was moving again, but differently now. He unslung his backpack and pulled out a small metal case. With impressive speed, he opened it to reveal a dozen small objects that looked like mechanical insects, each about the size of Phopix's thumb. Reconnaissance drones, Phopix realized. Expensive, sophisticated, nearly invisible to most sensor systems. The human activated them with a tap on his wrist-mounted control unit. The tiny machines came to life, their wings unfolding with soft whirs. Then they were airborne, dispersing in a spread pattern that would give them maximum coverage of the area ahead. Within seconds, they'd disappeared from sight. What happened next made Phopix gasp. The air around them suddenly filled with floating screens, dozens of them hanging in midair at eye level, each displaying a different view from the drone swarm. It was an entirely virtual interface, existing only in the shared perception space between Phopix's avatar and the human's implant. To anyone else observing them, they would have appeared to be staring at nothing. But to Phopix, it was overwhelming. Each screen showed crystal-clear imagery, updating in real time as the drone swept over the terrain. He could see topographical features, heat signatures, electromagnetic emissions, movement patterns. The amount of data was staggering, the kind of sensory overload that would have paralyzed most beings. But the human processed it all as if it was nothing. His eye flicked from screen to screen, dismissing irrelevant information, focusing on details that Phopix would never have noticed. How much of this was experience, Phopix wondered, and how much was the human's natural ability to understand new environments, to read terrain and tactical situations with their impressive thinking speed? The human's hand rose, one finger pointing at a screen showing a particular hill roughly 5 miles distant. "There," he said simply. Phopix looked at the image. It seemed unremarkable, a modest elevation covered in the same alien vegetation as everything else. "That what?" "That's my shooting position." The human was already manipulating the screen, zooming in on different angles of approach. 5-mile shot to the target location. Long range, even for me, but the wind conditions are favorable. And I've got self-propelled rounds with programmable trajectory curves. It's possible. Barely, but possible. Understanding dawned on Phopix slowly, then hit him all at once. His avatar's hearts, which shouldn't have existed but felt real nonetheless, seemed to stop. "You're going to shoot him from 5 miles away, through walls and security barriers and—" "Through 2 walls," the human corrected, dismissing the floating screen with a gesture. They vanished, leaving only reality. One reinforced, one standard construction. The self-propelled round can handle it. The curve programming will let me get the angle I need around the hard cover. It's definitely possible. But the security systems will detect the shot. The trajectory calculations alone would require a lot of practice, yeah. The human was already walking toward the hill, moving with that steady, ground-eating pace that soldiers developed. Good thing I've had plenty of time for that. Phopix stood frozen for a moment, his mind reeling. This was insane. You couldn't just shoot someone from 5 miles away through walls in the middle of an armed military base. The variables were too many, the margin for error too small. It was the kind of shot that existed only in dramatic fiction, the impossible feat that heroes accomplished in stories but never in reality. And yet the human was walking toward that hill as if this were the most natural thing in the world, as if 5-mile assassination shots were just another item on his daily to-do list. Phopix's avatar hurried to catch up. The journey was longer than it looked. Nearly an hour of steady walking through terrain that shifted from forest to rocky outcroppings to open fields of auburn grass that reached Phopix's waist. His avatar didn't grow physically tired, but his real body's exhaustion bled through the connection, creating a strange doubling of sensation. He was tired and not tired simultaneously, a paradox of consciousness that made his thoughts fuzzy. He tried to make conversation as they walked, asking about the human's plans, his backup strategies, his contingencies for when the impossible shot somehow failed. But the human had entered what Phopix had come to think of as his predator mode. His response was monosyllabic, his attention completely directed at their surroundings. He moved through the landscape like he had become part of it, reading signs that Phopix couldn't perceive, constantly assessing threats and opportunities. It was unnerving. It was also, Phopix had to admit, impressive. This was what apex predator species looked like when they operated in their natural element. Humans came from a death world, a planet where everything was trying to kill everything else, where survival meant developing better weapons, better strategies, better killing instincts than anything else in the ecosystem. And they'd spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting those skills before finally achieving spaceflight and discovering they weren't alone in the universe. The galaxy's other species had been horrified to discover what humans were capable of. Their violence, their sheer relentless effectiveness at warfare, it was the stuff of nightmares. Most species had evolved on worlds where cooperation was the key to survival. Humans had evolved on a world where competition and predation was the norm, and it showed in everything they did. Which was why Phopix reflected. The council kept one on retainer. Sometimes you needed a nightmare to fight other nightmares. They reached the base of the hill and began to climb. The human moved with steady determination, never pausing, never showing signs of fatigue despite the heavy pack and the weight of his weapons. Phopix followed, his avatar's legs pumping mechanically, mimicking the exertion that his real body was actually experiencing back in the comm center. At the summit, the human spent several minutes surveying the area before finally selecting a spot, a flat rock surface that would let him lie prone, with a smaller boulder nearby that he claimed would provide cover. Phopix couldn't see how the boulder would help. It was barely larger than a torso and positioned off to one side, but the human seemed satisfied. The rifle came out of the pack next. It was enormous, nearly as long as the human was tall, made of matte black composite materials that seemed to absorb all light. The human handled it with the reverence of a craftsman with a favored tool, checking each component, ensuring everything was in perfect order. "Old model," the human said, running his hand along the barrel. "Basically the same design for the last 500 years. You know why? Because they perfected it. There's nothing left to improve. The ballistics are optimal, the ergonomics are ideal, the reliability is absolute. When something works this well, you don't fix it." Phopix found that notion terrifying. 500 years of humane warfare, and this was what they decided was the perfect instrument of death. What did it say about a species that they'd spent half a millennium refining the art of killing at extreme range? The human pulled out a cylindrical attachment, a suppressor Phopix recognized. Then, with a casual motion, he tossed it aside. "We're not trying to be discreet here, are we?" The human's scarred mouth pulled into a grin. "Let 'em hear it. Let 'em know what happened. Might save lives in the long run if the next would-be warmonger knows that declaring war over a diplomatic incident might get you a bullet through the brain from 5 miles away. Phopix watched, fascinated despite the growing unease, as the human set up his shooting position. Every movement was economical. The rifle was positioned on a bipod, the angle calculated by eye, the breathing exercises beginning even before the weapon was fully ready. This was ritual, Phopix realized. This was the accumulated practice of decades distilled in a sequence of movements as natural as breathing. The human put his eye to the scope. For a long moment, he was silent, his body utterly still. Then he spoke, his voice distant, almost dreamy. They look like xenomorphs. Black exoskeletons, elongated heads, those sharp angular features, makes them easy to shoot at. Is it the size? Phopix asked hesitantly. Larger targets being easier to hit. No, the human's reply was immediate. It's the appearance. If they were cute, I'd have a harder time pulling the trigger. Simple as that. I know that sounds stupid, but psychology matters in this job. Phopix swallowed hard, his avatar's throat constricting in a sympathetic response to his real body's reaction. The casual admission was somehow more disturbing than if the human had claimed to feel nothing at all. The human pulled back from the scope and reached for his pack again. This time he produced a small case of specialized ammunition. Each round was enormous, easily the size of Phopix's forearm, and far more complex than simple bullets. These were miniaturized missiles, really, complete with guidance systems and propulsion. The human selected one round with a purple tip and several colorful markings along its casing. He held it up to the light, examining it with a critical eye. Self-propelled round with programmable curve capability, he explained, more to himself than to Phopix. Basically a small rocket that I can tell to curve its final approach vector, but it's not fire and forget. I need to have a very accurate mental image of the curve during the aiming process. The round reads my neural patterns through the implant and adjusts its internal guidance accordingly. Still takes skill, even with all the technological help. How will you find the Visek leader? Phopix asked. Surely he's not just standing in the open. The human smile widened fractionally. Already found him. A floating screen materialized in the air between them, another shared perception, visible only through their quantum link. It showed a thermal imaging view, looking through walls into the interior of a building. And there, rendered in bright red against cooler backgrounds, was a figure, the distinctive shape of a Visag, heat signature marking it clearly as a living being. The human pointed toward the distant base. Phopix could barely see it from here, just a collection of structures hazed by distance and atmospheric distortion. He's there, behind that window. Can you see it? The one on the third level of the tallest structure. Behind two walls, one reinforced with some kind of metal lattice meant to stop projectiles and shape charges. The other is a standard construction, probably just interior partition. He's in what looks like a command center, surrounded by his officers. Phopix squinted in the direction the human indicated. He thought he could maybe see the building, a dark shape against the landscape. The window was entirely invisible to him at this distance. How is that even possible? The human just shrugged and loaded the specialized round into his rifle with a solid click. I've made harder shots. Not many, but some. Then he was down on the rock, settling into his shooting position. The rifle became an extension of his body, melding with him in a way that was almost biological. His breathing slowed, became measured and rhythmic. His heartbeat, which Phopix could somehow sense through their connection, dropped to a barely perceptible thrum. Time seemed to stretch. Phopix found himself holding his breath, his avatar mimicking his real body's anticipation. He wanted to say something, to ask if the human was sure, to question whether this was really the right course of action. But the words died in his throat. This was already happening. The decision had been made in a council chamber, ratified by votes and bureaucratic process, and now it was being executed by a man lying on a rock 5 miles from his target. The human's finger moved to the trigger. There was no hesitation, no pause for moral consideration, just the steady pressure of a professional who had done this countless times before. The rifle fired. The sound was enormous, a crack that echoed across the landscape like thunder, startling a flock of Zentar's native flying creatures from their roost in nearby trees. Phopix flinched despite being just an avatar. His real body, distant in his chair, probably jumped as well. But the human was already on the floating screens, pulling up drone feeds, calculating, tracking. Phopix watched in horrified fascination as the imagery updated in real time. The bullet traveled first. He could see its trajectory plotted on one screen, a glowing line that arced through the air. Then, halfway to the target, its internal propulsion activated. The round accelerated, achieving speeds that no conventional projectile could match. The curve programming kicked in, and the trajectory began to bend, adjusting its path in ways that should have been impossible for something moving so fast. It entered the window, the tiny opening that Phopix could barely see with his own eyes, without touching the frame. Inside the building, it navigated through what must have been a complex interior layout. The first wall approached, the reinforced one. The round sensors detected it, calculated density and composition in microseconds, and adjusted trajectory to hit the optimal angle. It punched through. Phopix could see the hole appear on the thermal imaging, a bright spot where the metal had been instantly superheated by the round's passage. Then came the curve. The round's internal guidance system fired micro-thrusters, changing its vector by degrees that the human had somehow calculated and transmitted through nothing but the clarity of his mental image. It curved around a section of the hard wall, following a path that brought it into alignment with the softer interior partition. And then it was through. The final wall. The last barrier. The thermal image showed impact. The red shape of the facade Great Leader jerked, then crumpled. Secondary heat signatures, his guards, his officers began moving in panic. But it was too late. Their leader was down. The perfect shot executed across 5 miles of open terrain, through 2 walls, into the heart of what should have been an impregnable position. Phopix stood frozen. His avatar's eyes were wide, his mouth hanging open. Several seconds passed, maybe minutes, he couldn't tell, where his thoughts simply ceased to function. His entire reality had narrowed to that thermal image, to the fallen figure, to the impossible thing he had just witnessed. The sound of alarms finally penetrated his consciousness. Distant but growing louder, the wail of alert sirens from the facade base. They knew something had happened, they just didn't know what or from where. How could they? No one expected a precision assassination from 5 miles away. When Phopix finally managed to turn his head, he found that the human had already packed up his equipment. The rifle was disassembled and stowed, the spent casing retrieved, all evidence of their presence being systematically erased. And through the trees, Phopix could hear the whine of engines approaching. Their ship, piloted remotely by the human's wrist controls, coming to extract them. "Come on," the human said, slinging his pack. "Time to go." Phopix followed numbly, his avatar's legs moving on autopilot. They descended the hill at a much faster pace than they had climbed it, the human setting a punishing speed now that the job was done. Behind them, the sounds of chaos grew louder, more alarms, the thunder of military vehicles mobilizing, the confusion of an entire invasion force trying to understand what had just happened to their leader. Without a care in the world for stealth now, the ship landed very close to their position. The human jogged up the ramp without breaking stride, already removing pieces of his armor as he moved. Phopix stumbled after him, his avatar's coordination suffering as his real body's exhaustion finally caught up with him. Inside the ship, the human collapsed into the pilot seat and began the launch sequence. The engine spun up, and they were airborne before Phopix had even found his seat. The ship climbed rapidly through Centaur's atmosphere as Phopix stumbled after him, still processing what he had witnessed. "Back to standby now," the human said as they fled. "Little war problem solved." Phopix watched Centaur recede below them. Before disconnecting to report back to the Deathworld Council, one thought crystallized in his mind. It was indeed worth the exorbitant price of having a human permanently on call.